Good afternoon. Welcome to this lecture, the John Hope Franklin Distinguished Lecturer. First of all, I would like to encourage those students standing in the back of the room to take any available seat so that you can actually pay more attention to the lecture itself. My name is Vincent Wang. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Science. So thank you for coming this afternoon for this signature lecture of our ABC program, African, Black, and Caribbean Studies program. I'm gonna, and thank you, Director Professor Patricia Lespinasse, for inviting me to make a few remarks. I will only say a few words about Professor John Hope Franklin, whose name inspired and commemorate this lecture series. I'm sure that Professor Levinan will introduce our speaker today, Professor Davis today. So anyway, John Hope Franklin was born in 1915 and died in 2009. He was an American historian of the United States and the former president of the Phi Beta Kappa, which is the honor society. And our university is also trying to become one. The Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Society and Southern Historical Association. So he is a very accomplished, esteemed historian. And he is best known for his work, From Slavery to Freedom. This book was first published in 1947 and continually updated. In fact, more than 3 million copies have been sold. In 1995, President Bill Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, this nation's highest civilian honor. Franklin was born in Oklahoma, attended the Fisk University, which was a historically black university in Nashville, Tennessee. And then he received his PhD at Harvard University in 1941. He began a very distinguished academic career. He was a professor at Howard University, the elite historically black university in Washington, D.C. In 1956, he was named to head a history department at the Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, which is near us. And then he was later recruited to University of Chicago, my alma mater, in 1964, where he actually achieved a named professorship. He later became the chair of the department. And then in 1983, he was recruited to Duke University. Eventually, he acquired the James Duke Professorship at Duke University. As you can imagine, if a professor actually achieved the name of a university, that tells you a lot about the high esteem he was held. I wonder if Professor Marshall Darling is with us today, because I know Professor Darling actually graduated from Duke University. So, that actually gave me an opportunity to learn a lot about this lecture. So anyway, John Hope Franklin is a very important figure, not only an esteemed historian, but I think his legacy is very important to the mission of the Center for African, Black, and Caribbean Studies. That's why we have this named lectureship, and today we are very honored to commemorate his legacy. I'm going to ask Professor Levinan to introduce our speaker. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. That's not good enough. Good afternoon. A little better. Thank you to our wonderful dean for introducing and sort of welcoming you to the Center for African, Black, and Caribbean Studies. I'd like to thank all of you students, staff members, colleagues for coming out for this wonderful lecture by Dr. Christopher Davis. And I'd also like to thank Fabian Burrell as well as Tony Burden, staff of the Center for African, Black, and Caribbean Studies for putting this together and making sure you all are comfortable. There will be food in the back, pizza and drinks, please help yourself. In addition, we have tons of programming coming up. Our next program is by one of our professors, Professor Simona Legra, which is a film screening of Boca Chica, and you'll be getting a flyer for that soon. That's on March 4th from 3 to 5. And the director of Boca Chica, the film, will be here to have a Q&A with our students. We are here for the John Hope Franklin Lecture, and it is our annual lecture. And today we are really privileged to have Dr. Christopher Davis. Dr. Christopher Davis is the Assistant Professor of History in the African, Black, and Caribbean Studies program. Beginning in January 2022, he was hired here, and he is actually the first Assistant Professor of this particular program. He earned his doctorate in Atlantic History from Florida International University in 2018. He's a native of Brooklyn, New York. Dr. Davis also received his bachelor's in history from CUNY Hunter College in 2012, where he was a Ronald E. McNair Scholar and a Mellon Mays Fellow. He has previously been a visiting instructor at Florida Atlantic University and an adjunct lecturer at St. Elizabeth University. Dr. Davis's research focuses on race, identity, migration, citizenship, eugenics, and intellectual circuits within American, African American, Caribbean, and immigration histories. His primary research project examines the spread of racial science in the Anglophone Atlantic world. He analyzes how eugenic ideas originating from America and England sought to disrupt the anti-colonial movement in the British Caribbean. Recent courses taught by Dr. Davis include African American Studies, Black History in the US to 1865, Black History in the US from 1865 to the present, as well as the Civil Rights Movement and elements of Black culture. He also has a course entitled The History of the African Diaspora and a newer course which is The History of Racial Science. Dr. Davis consistently seeks to innovate and implement new methods to collaborate effectively with faculty, students, and staff to enhance research, teaching, and university programming, as well as our particular program. I am privileged to welcome Dr. Christopher Davis to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the strong turnout. I appreciate seeing familiar faces and new faces. So I will say, I want to first thank some people. So first I want to thank the sponsors, the ABC program. So I see the staff and faculty here. I want to thank you all. You guys know you mean the world to me. I also want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences, the Center of Academic Support and Enrichment, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. I also want to do a special shout out to the Department of History as well as the Honors College for the support I've been getting from faculty there alongside other friends and colleagues and students around the university, I also want to honor the legacy of John Hope Franklin because the type of work that I do cannot be done without type of ancestors and predecessors have built this type of platform, especially because this is a new type of work for me. Many of you might be familiar with what I normally do, but this is kind of a departure, and I'm excited to kind of see feedback and to gauge how people feel about the type of work I hope to do with this lecture. So with that being said, I'm going to move forward. How did I get into this pickle? How did I decide to kind of look at CLR James and this John Hope Franklin lecture? So for those who took my class before or have heard maybe a lecture in the past, you know why. It always goes back to eugenics. So, reading back issues of The Beacon, a literary organ of academics in 1930s Trinidad, became the first place I engaged with the words of prominent Trinidadian historian, journalist, and playwright CLR James. James is best known for his influential works on history, culture, and politics, but for this Beacon article, I was exploring his views on science and racism for my doctoral research on eugenics in the British Caribbean. James's article references a controversy about the inferiority of the African race, a submission by Dr. Sidney Cross Harlan, a white Englishman who was one of the first professors of the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, now known as the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine in Trinidad. Prior scholars on the Beacon, such as Harvey Neptune, Bridget Brereton, and Reinhard Sander, have primarily focused on the impact of the political aspects of the short stories that were fostered by a Caribbean intelligentsia. This collective takeaway is that the Beacon was designed for scholars of all backgrounds to express their unbiased views, but critically, it was to promote the evolution of West Indianists in an age of empire and anti-colonialism. The Beacon became a literary training site for future scholars and revolutionaries. Many in the Beacon group of writers joined different sides of the political movements in Trinidad, as well as throughout the Caribbean throughout the 1900s. The Beacon also provided locals with creative outposts to lash out at the oppressiveness of the British Empire and the concerns of a global Great Depression on the region's future. The middle-class editors of the Beacon includes two Portuguese Trinidadians, Albert Gomez and Albert Mendez, as well as Afro-Trinidadian CLR James. They felt that literature and intellectualism can provide a route for the oppressed people of the Caribbean to organize, resist, and tackle colonial rule. Although eugenics had become a popular academic exercise regarding their research and accompanying discussions worldwide by the 1920s, new waves of scholars have rejected many of their principles. The rise of voices that emerged in Trinidad spurred against the acceptance of British culture and customs as the only way of living proper lives. The writers fought against any explanation of people of color not succeeding in colonized spaces and used fiction and nonfiction to explore Caribbean identity to negate the racism of eugenics. But thus, we come into conflict. In Race Admixture, a controversial publication by Sidney Harlan, he came down very hard on Afro-Caribbeans. In his words, Harlan argued that the science was clear that Negroes would always be inferior to whites. Our conclusion is, therefore, while it's not apparent to what extent the Negro is inferior to the intelligence of the white man, there is little doubt on the average he's inferior. Harlan said that Europeans always had a sense of superiority, but their Christian heritage told them to suppress what they innately knew. He reasoned that the development of Darwinism and eugenics had allowed humanity to study empirically evidence proving white superiority. Dr. Harlan argued many tests have been carried out in the United States to discover what differences there are between the white and the colored elements in the population regarding intelligence. All of the mentioned tests found that pure Negroes scored 69.2% as high as whites, that three-quarter Negroes scored 73.2% as high, that mulattoes scored 81.2%. Harlan further submitted that Negroes could never rise to the level of great men, and only people like Toussaint Louverture, who we'll talk about in a moment, had any semblance of black excellence, but he was a genetic outlier. This, frankly, enraged CLR James, In The Intelligence of the Negro, Few Words by Dr. Harlan, James disputed many of the elements of Harlan's submission. He had no problems in pointing out that Harlan used eugenics as a way to hold on to outmoded ways of thinking about race, unlike other fields of academia which had shed previously prejudiced messages. Furthermore, James argued that a man like Harlan, who has resided in the West Indies for several years, educated dozens of black students, and witnessed blacks excel in law, medicine, and the arts, was a man hardened in prejudiced ways. First is that there might be Negroes who might read this article and misled by his reputation, feel that in some internal disquiet. Dr. Harlan, I think it's fair to say, means well. He obviously likes to think of himself as a man with no prejudice, a truly scientific man, compelled after deep study and thought to come to the conclusion that the Negro is about 5, or is it 10% inferior to the white man in intellect? But science is the only department in human life where the heart must not lead the mind. It is not necessary for Harlan to mean well. It is far more that he should think well. But far from thinking well, it seems that Dr. has not thought at all. Thus, we see in a response by Harlan in October 1931, not only did he double down, he said that there is no pathway for the Negro to get to the level of the white man. This only added to a fierce debate as other writers, whether they're locals or scientists around the world, contributed to an 18-month debate over the abilities of science and race. Ultimately, this exposed a lot of the racial tension that emerged in Trinidadian intellectual circles, and ultimately reveals one thing that African descent people dealt with after emancipation, that they're subjected to negative views about their intelligence. Before, they're inherently criminal, and now science was trying to prove their inferiority. In the end, Dr. Harlan actually left Trinidad because he felt that he himself was racially discriminated against. Because although he actually did have a child with a woman who was black, he also married a woman who had Chinese origin, and he says that he was breaking some of the social norms of Trinidad at this time. But in the world of cotton, Dr. Harlan is still seen as one of the most impressive scholars of his generation, that he revolutionized how cotton was produced, particularly in tropical agriculture, thus showing some of the conflicts of the different aspects of the eugenicists of this time. The Beacon as a journal actually ceased to exist by 1940, but as I mentioned, some of the names that emerged became some of the leaders of what many call the revolutionary writers of the West Indian independence movement. This further established the idea that eugenicists and activists were in a battle over institutional legitimacy. So ultimately, James's famous war of words, with Harlan may have shaped a generation of Caribbean scholars who challenged the imposition of eugenics against them, but is far from his most prominent work as a scholar. Nevertheless, the intelligence of the Negro, a few words with Dr. Harlan, reflected the type of scholar James was, someone who would come to the call to defend black people. He demonstrated this with much grander and prominent contributions to academia, the Black Jacobins, and beyond a boundary. James's most celebrated work, The Black Jacobins in 1938, explores the Haitian Revolution and its significance in the struggle for freedom and equality, established him as a critical voice for post-colonial studies. His deep engagement with the themes of race, class, and anti-colonialism continued in his other works, most prominently Beyond the Boundary in 1963, where he uses the sport of cricket as a lens to examine Caribbean identity and cultural dynamics. In this lecture, I plan to show how CLR James's famous writings, Black Jacobins and Beyond the Boundary, provided both overt and covert messages about colonialism in the British Caribbean. Each of these books advocated for the demolishing of imperialism and waved flags of black liberation, from an Afro-Trinidadian middle-class Marxist point of view. His access to historical documents allowed him to craft a detailed and engaging narrative on the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, and his global travels allowed him to rethink what was possible in a sport history book. Yet, James did not take for granted his position as a black scholar during a time where much of the black world lived in some position of oppression. James did not want to stay in the comfort of an easy middle-class lifestyle if it meant that other black peoples couldn't enjoy levels of sovereignty. He used his literary prowess to inspire radicals to think about how to dismantle structures of oppression. So, a brief overview of how this might be a different version of the PowerPoint. Give me 1 second. So we'll make it work. So first I'll introduce a biography of James, then I'll discuss his work in Saint-Domingue, known as the Haitian Revolution, then I'll switch to what is cricket, and eventually I'll look at how both of them shows different aspects of his work. So here's a brief timeline of the life of CLR James. And I'll discuss some of those aspects right here. Cyril Lionel Robert James was born in Tunapuna, Trinidad in 1901. In Beyond the Boundary, the cricket book, he talks a lot about his upbringing, showing how he uses both as an autobiography, a sports history book, but still a book about engaging liberation. He emphasized how his puritanical upbringing as a youth drew him into the educational opportunities available on the island. He will ultimately be educated at Queen Royal College in Port of Spain before pursuing further studies in England. Throughout his life, he was an active participant in political movements and connections to various revolutionary figures and ideas, including Marxism and Pan-Africanism. It was openly in England where he becomes a sports writer and got involved in Trotskyist groups, contributing to debates on colonialism, independence, and cultural identity in the process. His legacy continues to inspire scholars and activists around the world. There are several academic communities that focus on the writings and teaching of James. But ultimately, his most arguable impact as a professor was toward his student, Eric Williams. Eric Williams, as you may know, was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago upon independence, and is well known for his seminal work, Capitalism and Slavery. Although both of them share similar goals concerning independence and the advancement of the Caribbean, their ideologies diverged. Williams was more pragmatic, seeking to work within the system in order to create change. However, as we'll see, James was far more radical in his socialist beliefs and his belief in the revolutionary potential of the working class. This radical tradition is demonstrated in his major publications. So now I'm going to start by doing a brief introduction to the Black Jacobins and the San Domingo Revolution. Here is a brief timeline of the Haitian Revolution. And here is an overview. In 1938, Black Jacobins, James provides an overview of the Haitian Revolution and its significance to the revolutionary struggles of the 20th century. He introduces Toussaint Louverture as a central figure. James's thesis argues that Toussaint's actions were intrinsically linked to the socio-political context of the time, particularly the interplay of class, race, and aspirations of enslaved and free people of color seeking liberation from a brutal system entrenched in slavery and colonialism that also would ultimately shape how Toussaint became a leader. The following is a summary of events that led up to Haiti's independence. Critically, one thing that has to be discussed is the relationship between the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution. The document on the screen, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789, shows how the French Revolution outlines principles of individual rights and collective freedoms for a new French society. It emphasizes that all men are born free and are equal in rights, including liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. This declaration asserts that the source of all sovereignty resides in the nation, and the governmental authority must serve the common good. It affirms the importance of legal equality, freedom of speech, and the right to participate in public affairs. The document laid the groundwork for the modern democratic principles for advocating for the protection of civil liberties and the rule of law. But critically, these principles will not just be retained in the minds of Europeans in France, and it will travel across the Caribbean to hopefully establish a new idea about French citizenship. French citizenship for those in the Caribbean. At the same time, in Saint-Domingue, before the start of the revolutions that rocked the French Empire, the French side of the Hispaniola island, then known as Saint-Domingue, was economically, culturally, and politically divided by region. As the ideas of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution start to fuel new notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the various groups of Haiti start to take note. The white planter elite class held a considerable amount of power on the island, but still felt constrained by colonial authorities. They detested the mercantilistic system and they wanted free trade. Lower class whites wanted equality of citizenship that was granted to all whites, not just landed whites, as well as loosening administrative control. However, they still want to maintain the racial hierarchy. They want to be sure that they were still better than the free persons of color. Free blacks and mixed race Haitians focused on equality and fraternity with whites, claiming that they fulfilled all qualifications to be active citizens and were more qualified than a substantial number of the whites who wanted to become part of these higher classes. And as we can see, the island is divided into several sections, with those in the north being the majority of the enslaved, but also the stronghold of the planter elite. As we go further down south, we can see that mixed people of color, as well as free colored people, had some dominance. On the western end, diverse crops and small estates. Thus, the geography led to political rivalries, as the north had more slave revolts, but the south saw much more race issues between poor whites and free blacks. This will ultimately lead from the transition, at least on the island, from the ideas of the French Revolution to the establishment of the Haitian Revolution. During the Age of Revolution, we'll see that places like the United States and France undergo political changes. The idea of the alignment very much shaped the idea of going towards some democratic participation in government and the end of inequality amongst men. But yet, you have, alongside this, the victims of the transatlantic slave trade and the descendants seeking any level of decency, any level of human rights. Despite the revolutionary talk discussed in France, much of the wealth of the empire came from individuals participating in the slave trade. In fact, the sugar plantations, alongside coffee, cacao, and other exotic crops grown on the French side of Hispaniola, accounted for a large percentage of France's exports and total wealth at the time. Thus, despite the language of liberty, equality, and fraternity, exploitation of the enslaved were necessary to continue the growth of the French Empire. However, the actions of the enslaved individuals, which was then Saint-Domingue, show that they were no longer interested in being exploited. They were no longer interested in being property. The Haitian Revolution was marked by the first conspiracy by Bookman, a voodoo high priest that was African-born, who was well aware of the discussions of the French Revolution and decided to attack. In July 1791, he planned a massive 6,000-man rebellion on Le Cap, the crucial northern city of the island, to fire down all the plantations, exterminate the whites, and take the colony for themselves. Although the plan did not succeed in its entirety, the scope and organization of the revolt shows, in the words of James, Bookman to be the first in that line of great leaders, whom the slaves were to throw up in such profusion and rapidity during the years which followed. That such conspiracy was not discovered until it actually broken out is a testimony to its solidarity. One thing that James stresses throughout the text is that the white planting elite of French Empire could not imagine the ability of enslaved black people to organize and demand their human rights. Once again, in quote, "The slaves have revolted because they wanted to be free, but no ruling class ever admits to such things. The white Caucasians accused the patriots and the friends of the Negro of stirring up the revolt, where the red Caucasians accused the royalists and the counter-revolution in France. The small whites accused the mulattoes and massacred them in sight in the streets." The leadership that emerges from the black and mixed race communities of Saint-Domingue shows that the ideas of alignment cannot just be contained to European underclasses. James very much shows that these alignment ideas shape new class consciousness, where there were oppressed people who need to eliminate the elite to gain their freedom. However, the middle classes that received more prestige were stuck between keeping a system where they might benefit more, or the unknown where they may no longer be part of the hierarchy of power. Thus, James introduces his main character throughout this text, Toussaint. Throughout the 1790s, revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue were not just content with race and class war in colony. He had to contend with other empires seeking to take advantage of a vulnerable territory. invading Spanish and English troops, and the French military came to Saint-Domingue to restore order and possibly benefit. The military expertise of Toussaint in this decade became critical to this movement, as the forces were able to lead the dismissal of the British and chart a counter-invasion to the Spanish side of the island. Due to his success as a military general, he was able to actually broker a deal with the French government that saw him become Governor General for life in a semi-independent state. Seeking to rebuild the economy, Toussaint was able to restore commercial relations with the British and the United States. However, once Napoleon would seek to reclaim control of the French-American Empire, he would capture Toussaint, banish him to the Alps, and not only end African self-rule in Haiti, but restore slavery in the colonies. Although Toussaint would be deposed as the ruler of Haiti, the second in command, the Salies, was successful in what James called the War of Independence against France. Thus, the newly renamed Haiti would become the first independent black country established in Americas by an ex-slave community on January 1st, 1804. This event was a great disruption to the system. Many white planters left Haiti, as they could not imagine living in equality with those who they formerly enslaved. Additionally, some of those believed that the knockoff events of the Haitian Revolution will see planter classes living in fear, advocating for greater laws to discipline enslaved people to ensure that another Haiti, another Haitian nation does not emerge in the Americas. However, other knockoff effects happened. Many Latin American countries, upon their independence from Spain, will automatically end slavery in those territories. That in 1807, the British abolitionists were able to advocate for the end of the transatlantic slave trade. And throughout the 1800s, we'll see the diminishing of slave societies throughout the Americas. So that was a brief discussion of both the book and the revolution, but I do think it's important to kind of go to what was James trying to say with this book. Although this is a rigorously researched historical book with engaging writing style, sometimes it felt more like a novel than history, it's critical to acknowledge the two major themes that this book has. The first one is the class and social dynamics. This book explores the internal class struggles amidst the enslaved and free people of color, and how class dynamics played a crucial role in the revolution. James argues that the conflict was not solely about race, but class interests, showcasing an interplay between socio-economic factors and a quest for independence. In the Black Jacobins, James describes the motivations and interests of factions, like enslaved Africans, who wanted the complete emancipation of those in the country. The mixed race, who sought to gain greater rights and privileges, but still as landowners did not necessarily want to share that with the lower classes. Once again, with the planters, who wanted to maintain the institution of slavery to keep the profits high, but also wanted to gain more autonomy from the French colonial government, who wanted to keep the system as similar as it was as possible. And then you have outside powers like Spain and Britain watching what was going on for their own geopolitical agendas. Thus, one of the major conflicts of this book is not just between black and white groups, but within black and white groups. James's Marxist lens is critical here, as it demonstrates it demonstrates that the lack of unity between mixed race and lower class whites and associating with free and enslaved blacks prolonged the revolution and limited opportunities for true equality. I'll provide a quote here from 116. The cause of men of color is that the cause of the patriots of the old third estate and finally the people so long oppressed. So has spoken Bristol and Prissot, representative of the third estate, was prepared to help the third estate of mulattoes and give the people in France, as well as Saint-Domingue, praises. The French peasants were still clamoring for assembly to relieve them of the feudal dues. The Brustins would not do it. They would not touch property, and the slaves were property. Another critical thing that emerges from this text is the importance of leadership. James portrays key figures, particularly Toussaint, as demonstrating complexities of leadership within the revolution. He emphasizes that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were active agents who shaped their own destinies, forming a revolutionary consciousness that challenged the established order. One thing that's to be noted is that Haitian Revolution was a splintering of the French Revolution. The influence cannot be understated that the eternal words liberty, equality, and fraternity were very much heard by the key conspirators on the plantation. This was seen with James rotating chapters between all the belligerents in the conflict. But a key difference is that although the French Revolution sought to give the masses in European France the same level of citizenship, these were to only be limited to white France. The Haitian Revolution was to disrupt the entire structure. Although the war fought amongst different groups of enslaved Africans, free blacks, mixed-race individuals, and white colonists, one thing James tried to show was that the moment of elimination of class to form a new identity, the Haitian identity. He also showed nuanced understanding of Toussaint as he tried to mediate a Haitian nation where property-owning mulattoes were protected from the brunt of violence. Yet he tried to shape the war as a war of black liberation from French imperialism. James touted Toussaint's leadership as the steadying guide of revolution. Toussaint himself was a formerly enslaved individual who only came into prominence at the age of 45. His participation in the rebellions is what shaped the type of person he became. A critical aspect of James' retelling of Toussaint's role concerns himself with the length of the war. Apologies, I think my PowerPoint is a bit off, but I will get right to the boundaries in a moment. Additionally, the French government grew more frustrated with the inability to crush the rebellion as it dragged on. Toussaint's ability to mediate between different factions and keep the broader goals of black liberation showed his influence. Although he appointed himself governor for life, when Bonaparte's forces eventually captured him and deported him to France when he died, he was able to still keep that spirit with his second in command. The revolution continued despite his death, and the Isle of Saint-Domingue was able to free itself from French rule in 1804. So I'm going to move ahead to Beyond a Boundary. And what I would like to do is show that although Beyond the Boundary is a book of historical sports history, it shows some of the similar ideas that we saw with Black Jacobins. But there might be a question for many of you. Many of you may not know what cricket is. By raise of hands, how many people in this room know what cricket is? Do you really know what cricket is? Okay. So what we're going to do is let the world tell us what cricket is.
Cricket is a bat and ball sport that involves two teams with 11 players on each side. The aim of the game is to score more runs than the opposition. One player, the bowler, bowls a hard leather ball that speeds of up to 150 kilometers per hour at a player from the opposing team, who then attempts to hit it with a bat in order to score runs. Cricket is played on an oval-shaped field, and in the middle of that field is the pitch, which is where most of the action takes place. At either end of the pitch, you'll find these things. They're called wickets, and they're made up of 3 wooden stumps that support 2 bails. They're important, but we'll come back to them shortly. The batting team has 2 batters at a time in play, whilst the fielding side has all 11 players on the field. A batter scores runs in 2 ways. 1. They hit the ball far enough that it crosses the outer boundary of the field. If the ball has bounced, it's worth 4 runs. If it clears the boundary on the full, it's worth 6, the maximum number of runs that can be scored from 1 hit. 2. Through the 2 batters running the length of the pitch in opposite directions whilst the fielders are retrieving the ball. 1 length of the pitch completed equals 1 run. The aim for the fielding side is to restrict the number of runs scored by the batting side whilst trying to get the batter out. There are 11 different ways a batter can be out, with the most common being bowled. The bowler bowls the ball, the batter misses it or deflects it by accident, it hits the stumps and the bails come off. Caught. The batter hits the ball and one of the fielders catches it before it hits the ground. Leg before wicket, LBW. Exactly what the name suggests. The bowler bowls the ball, the batter misses it, and the ball hits them on the leg in line with the stumps. Run out. The batter hits the ball and runs, but the fielding team retrieve the ball and throw it to the stumps before either batter has reached the other end. When a batter's out, they leave the field of play and another teammate replaces them. Once all the batters on a team are out, the sides swap, and the fielding team then have their turn to bat and attempt to beat the overall score set by the first batting team. Put simply, the winner is the team with the most runs after both sides have batted.
So thank you for letting me show you that. So I'll tell you my first experience with cricket. So my family comes from an island called Barbados, and there, when I'd spend summers with my father, my uncle, my half-brother, and my cousins, they try to teach me this funny sport. And I call it funny because there's very particular rules that we'll get into a little bit. But probably the most prominent rule is, if you're doing test cricket, imagine playing basketball for 5 days, but also taking breaks for tea and lunch, wearing all white even though you're going to get dirty. And I thought it was very particular seeing such a, what I think was an upper class sport being played in such rudimentary ways. I remember taking a 2x4, having to cut it to have like a handle, and then my cousin would get a duct tape on the tennis ball because he can afford one of these. I'll pass this around. To be fair, I wouldn't want to be hit by that type of ball, so I'll take the duct tape tennis ball instead as well. But as a Yankee boy spending time with my family, it's really interesting seeing how this unveiled not just an aspect of my family's culture, but aspect of the British Empire in itself. The reason why I ask this question is that most people that I know don't play cricket because many of my friends aren't from the British Empire. So unless the ones are from the Caribbean or from India or from Pakistan, funny enough, apparently Afghanistan has a really good team now. It's not necessarily the most widespread sport versus the most popular export from England, soccer. So when I first read this book, I thought I was getting something different. I thought I was just getting a straight history about this sport. What I got was something a little different. What I got was a very complex book for a very complex game. As I mentioned, the most popular or most well-known version of cricket is a 5-day international, usually played against these international teams. And when I say it's all day, it's all day. So probably the most famous one is called the Ashes, which is played against England versus Australia. And I remember one year I had to watch it when I was there. My uncle would not let me change the TV. And it enthralled the entire nation, even though no one from Australia or England and Barbados that day. And I think the book very much shows how complex this sport is to certain groups within the British Empire. This book has many complexities. It's not a linear tale. Sometimes he'll jump decades, centuries behind to tell a certain point. Sometimes it serves as an autobiography. It shows the life of a young CLR James in Trinidad, then his life as a sports journalist both in the United States and in England, and his love of keeping up with this game in all capacities in his life. James ultimately used this space as also a critique. That as much as he loves this sport, he sees it doing two things. He sees it as a tool of control, but also an opportunity for people to emerge from control. So the first thing he mentions in his text is Puritanism. The idea of Victorian age morality shaped his life as a young boy in Trinidad. That he felt that playing the sport only reinforced some of these principles as a subject within the British Empire. And at this point, the Caribbean was no more than a backwater area of this empire. Long from the days that we saw in Haiti being probably the most prominent sugar colony, alongside the other colonies, much of the Caribbean was in the midst of Great Depression by the time we get to this period in his life. So maintaining this idea of being part of the British system, even though very much being outside the British system, shapes his identity. Sorry. I'll read a sample from the text kind of showing how the rules of cricket reinforces these ideas. But as soon as we stepped into the cricket or football field, more particularly the cricket field, all was changed. We were a motley crew, children of white officials and white businessmen, middle-class blacks and mulattoes, Chinese boys, some whose parents were still speaking broken English, Indian boys, some whose parents could speak no English at all, and some poor black boys who had won exhibitions or whose parents had starved and toiled on the plots of agricultural land and were spending their hard-earned money on giving their eldest boy an education. Yet, we rapidly learned to obey the umpire's decision without question, however irrational it was. We learned to play with the team, which meant subordinating your personal inclinations and interests for the good of the whole. We kept a stiff upper lip in that we did not complain about ill fortune. We did not denounce failures, but well-tried and hard luck came easily out of our lips. We were generous opponents and congratulated them on victories even though we knew they didn't deserve it. We lived in two worlds. Inside of classrooms, the heterogeneous jumble of Trinidad was battered and jostled and shaken down into some sort of order. On the playing field, we did ought to be done. So thus, even though James, a lifelong radical, he was questioning himself. He wondered, was he benefiting from this system? Was he still adapting to this system? This was a system that allowed him to live a life of travel, where he can use his mind to make a living. He also grappled with how other people in similar situations, other Afro-Caribbeans, other middle-class cricketers, and other lower-class British subjects had to work within the system or challenge the rules to feel comfortable within the empire. As he said on page 65, cricket plunged me into politics long before I was aware of it. When I did turn to politics, I didn't have much to learn. Additionally, one level of politics that he had to deal with is with the captain of the West Indies team. So many people know what makes up much of the West Indies today would be people of color, particularly those in the British West Indies, people who are most likely of African descent, with traces of people who might be of Indian and Chinese heritage, probably from indentured servitude. And that's the complex relationship that the West Indies team has to this day. But even in 1963, a time where there's revolutions and independence of many Caribbean nations, we still see the hierarchy at play. On 232, you know who will be the captain of England in 1963? You see that Barbados boy, Banon, who went to India? He only has to make 50 in one innings and he'll be the captain. Banon is white. Walcott is not claiming the captaincy for himself or for anyone in particular. I repeat, that is not that kind of person at all. His chief complaint, as I've gathered over the years, is that if you're the captain, then captain, carry on your ideas. Don't come bother me about them. An individual easily gets over the fact that he's disappointed in the desire to be captain. It is his constant, vigilant, bold, and shameless manipulation of players to exclude black captains that so demoralized West Indian teams and exacerbated a people that is to be remembered in the full tide of transition from colonialism to independence. This is much more of a direct statement than an allegory. The fact is the best players in the team were black, but you still need a European Caribbean person to be the captain to reflect the social and racial order. Yet, James makes it clear there is ways of breaking the system. He argues that the hero worship that he saw throughout the cricket world changes the system. That the cricketers who did not follow the rules are the ones who revolutionized the sport. Those who revolutionized the sport allowed access to the sport for those who could not access the sport previously. He argues that W.G. Grace was one of these men that activated a pre-Victorian past to evolve the sport. On 160, W.G. Grace was one of these men who, W.G. Grace was a Victorian, but the game he transformed into a national institution was not Victorian either in origin or essence. It was a creation of a pre-Victorian England, of the two generations that preceded the ascension of the Queen, the England of the early Dickens and of William Hazlitt. It was an England that still unconquered by the Industrial Revolution. It traveled by saddle and carriage. Wherever it could eat and drink prodigiously, it was not finicky in morals, it enjoyed life, it prized the virtues of frankness, independence, individuality. They were rulers and the ruled, educated and the uneducated. If the groupings could be described as two nations, they were neither of them conscious of the division of the state of things that ought to be. Thus, there was a break from tradition. One remarkable aspect of cricket is that although a Victorian-era sport that has very strict rules, it's become the sport of the masses who makes the effort to make their own style. When you make your own style, it can be adopted as a team, and that team can perfect said style. When that style is then perfected, it can be a tool of change. Once again, 222, James positions from talking about particular movements of a cricketer to show new identities that emerged throughout the empire. New techniques consist in lessening the margins, not in maintaining or expanding them. Some young romantic will extend the boundaries of cricket technique with a classical perfection. He will hit against the break so hard, so often, that the pole-bowlers will wish that it would go back to hitting with it. He'll drive the overhead and push through any number of short legs, as WG used to, so that the whole race of bowlers will go underground for 15 years as they once, and once more emerge with new tricks. To which some nationalist fanatics will add his ancestry and his timing. He might come from Pussy, or South Sydney, Norangar, or Bridgetown. Wherever he comes from, and whatever he does, he'll be doing what WG did, reshaping the medium so it can give satisfactions to new people. So in the end, cricket is just a sport. Its expression is on the eye of the beholder. But James argued that he wants the reader to understand that the slight changes in technique, these innovators, they changed the empire. That now these people are not part of the British Empire, now they're from England. They're from Australia, they're from India, and now they're from Barbados. The longer the sport is in the hands of the masses, it can now become a tool for self-identity and possibly for liberation. So I'm gonna wrap up. I know that we're just about out of time, but there's two key conclusions that I think links these two books together. Ultimately, the personal and collective identity that James shows, and also the critique of power structure that he demonstrates. James intertwines life experiences with historical analysis, creating a narrative that resonates with both personal and collective levels. By sharing reflections on the impact of colonialism and the significance of sport within his upbringing, he emphasizes how the individual stories are interwoven with larger societal movements towards liberation and empowerment. In his critique of power structures, James critiques power structures addressing the interplay between race, class, and colonialism. He articulates how the literature can reveal these dynamics, encouraging readers to question the status quo and engage in resistance against oppressive systems. So these are some of the readings, and I'll take any questions. Thank you for your time.
You said that cricket helped to give the colored people of the British Empire a voice in the social hierarchy. Do you think that there are other institutions that do that, like sports or scouts in the U.S.? Yes.
So I think that is a good point, right? That I think that what James shows with cricket is that as we move on in generations, there is more opportunities for people to speak for themselves, right? And I think he established, for example, we go back to the Haitian Revolution, right? He established that people were advocating for themselves and recognizing their oppression, they can speak for themselves, right? And then cricket ultimately became this voice. It was something that was imposed on them, right? they could have played other sports, but they noticed that many of these cricketers would come from the Caribbean and they'll move to England. And then from there, they can have voice. One person I didn't mention in the book, he went from a cricketer from Trinidad, and he became a government official in England. And there, he can advocate for both the empire, he would advocate for those in the Caribbean, but also for the black residents of England. So it becomes a platform. So that's the way you can use, I know you said, is there other ways of doing it? And I think James himself, right? James became a writer. James was able to kind of foster this idea that education was a way out. That's how he got out. His friends used cricket. And eventually maybe people used other, institutions. But the hard part is that he himself said that he had to work within the empire to do what he had to do. And he grappled with that in his work. And I think that's something that is the hard part. You have to find the instrument, I would say, that allows you to expose yourself, but at the same time, how much can you challenge the system if the system allows you to do certain things? So I think that's a great question, but definitely, I think education is probably the other prominent way at this time for particularly Afro-Caribbean people to kind of have that level of exposure.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. Beyond the Boundary was set in the 1930s. Yes.
It was set in, it jumps around. So I would say he was born in 1901. I would say his childhood was a big part of it, but it goes all the way to, it was published in 1963. So that's probably some of the last documentation that he provides, but he goes back to the 1800s. He jumps around.
Okay, so my question is, given that a lot of this work was between early independence in the Caribbean, do you see any relevance of his work today in the Caribbean or in the colonies?
Oh, for sure. I think that's the thing that he grapples with, right? That since he's about Marxist, he kind of wants to, he wants the system to be dismantled in some ways. And I think for him, he very much questions, we saw his disagreement with his student Williams. Williams was advocating to be part of the system. And I think for James and some of the cohort that he ran with, particularly, involved with some of those Marxist communist systems, he wants to kind of feel that even if you keep some of the system, there's still so much of these colonial legacies and people don't break out of it. And I think you can see in his reading, he grapples with it that he wonders how much of it is that he's still stuck in these legacies himself, right? When he talks about cricket and talks about how he keeps onto these rules, right? It's like, but part of him wants to change. And he always enjoyed the cricketers who was able to kind of challenge themselves and challenge those rules because they were criticized. They were sometimes booed out of the stadium. So I do think that's the level of relevance, right? How much are you willing to change the system? Is the system good enough now where you don't have to challenge it? Or is there still these colonial legacies that maintain levels of oppression against these people who don't have the ability to speak for themselves, right? So that's a great question. I think we're still grappling with that. I think he's just a great voice for that type of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. I wonder, I'm thinking about this in terms of you led us through James's analysis of the Haitian Revolution and the profound complexity of different racial groups and different socioeconomic dynamics on the side. And as the revolution is percolating, he sort of looks to Toussaint Louverture, this great leader, and sort of elevates him in the book and really sort of talks about his profound leadership abilities. And I have not read the book on cricket, but we have sort of this placement of the player from Barbados who sort of becomes this individual who's able to sort of change the game because of his expertise. And I wonder, as an historian, if you think there's an effort here on the part of James to kind of take a look at all the great men who sort of march across the stage of history and to mix it up a bit by putting into this mix men who are not necessarily sort of the white, the European, the imperial.
Yeah. Excellent question. I think he's very much in the generation of thinking about the great men in history. That's how he titled the book with Toussaint, right? And if you, once again, the good thing, but also the confusing thing about Beyond the Boundary, I enjoy the book, to be very clear. He brings in a lot of characters. So I bring in WG, he's an Englishman. He also brings in forgetting something, there's so many mini biographies that he will weave in. So it is kind of this complex way of looking at these great men within the cricket world, especially if you're not familiar with the cricket world. He's giving you that history, but he's also showing how maybe a smaller cricketer that you don't know that much was very much influential in some of the changes in the game. So I think he does focus on these individual sketches. That's part of I think his writing technique is he talks about himself, right? He focuses on maybe individuals and how they make up the collective. So he might do the great man in one text, but in this text he combines some of these great men with maybe lesser known cricket stars to kind of show that different parts of the empire was affected by how cricket was exposed, and it does shape the coloniality, of his moment.
So with this work and then the kind of stuff that you discussed, bringing it into the present day with current struggles and what's going on around the world, what do you think the takeaways from his books would be for how to kind of navigate that and bring about radical change?
That's a great question. I think one thing with his books when it comes to thinking about that is, how uncomfortable are you with change? I think that's the one thing he stresses, is that if you're breaking, go back to the boundaries, right? The idea of these people innovate the sport becomes better. The video I showed you just now, right, where they're doing different types of pitching. Some of those pitches did not exist 100 years ago. It took a bold effort to decide, I'm gonna do a jump spin and hit the ball versus just kind of roll it, right? That some of the techniques that people innovate were booed and seen as, they were pushed away. And I think even goes back to the slave revolts, right? That one thing that was very adamant that he made clear is that the conspiracy by Bookman was not betrayed by anybody. Everyone follows slave narratives and history of slave conspiracies. Many enslaved people will sell out the leader because they're too scared of changing the system. They don't want to be enslaved, but they also don't know the unknown. And I think that's the key thing, is that, are you willing to be challenged by the unknown? Are you willing to be uncomfortable of a future where you don't know what's going to happen? You hope for the best. I mean, in the case of the Haitians, we get a new nation, right? But in other cases, we see, particularly in the United States and the other Caribbean islands, we see more levels of oppression. So it's always that tension of, are you prepared for the consequences? And that's probably one thing that you can take away, is that he's saying you have to go for it anyway if you want to see this type of change.
I noticed that you keep saying that people can be intimidated by the unknown. But in my experience with learning history, the system really only gets worse if the revolution ends prematurely after the radical change in structure. The people don't make sure that it's built in the way they want, such as in Russia, when it was reformed, it was not reformed for the better, in my opinion. It was made into this sort of reflection of what it used to be. And really, in order to have a better nation, you really need to make sure that you're not just making the same thing, or even worse, just with a different flag.
Thank you for your comment. I mean, I would say one thing though, and I guess what I was leading towards with this tension about revolution, is that in the end, we're only looking history from the present, right? We don't know how a course is going to turn until it actually happens. And you're right in the sense that people can be poor decision makers, and that can lead to a downfall of revolution. And I think, as we can see, Toussaint was to be this leader, right? And he might have had these visions of a Haiti that he didn't get to live out. And unfortunately, Haiti ultimately had to go and deal with the brunt of returning French. They had to pay terrible taxes that they only stopped paying literally a few years ago, right? So maybe they couldn't live out that legacy because other external factors. They might have been great leaders and great decisions, and as time goes on, those decisions and those leaders were not able to capitalize. So I think you're right to say that, yeah, the unknown is something that we can't, like, you know, how did you say it, right? But I think that at the same time, we're looking at history now. We can't really go back to those exact moments and kind of say, if we make that one change, the butterfly effect, things can go in a different direction.
Things really only tend to be going, you know, in a direction you don't want it to go. They're not really holding it strong on a time leash. You gotta focus on what you need and make sure you get it before you go home.
I mean, I think I probably have to talk to you a little bit more on the side to get a little bit more what you're saying on that end. I get what you're saying, but I also think that the difficult part is that as actors, I don't think we always have the full control over the trajectory of things that are going. That's just my opinion.
Please, another round of applause.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and Professor Davis, thank you for your critical work again, and we hope to see you at our next event on March 4th.